Well, hello everybody. It is 2 o'clock, and that means that it is tea time with me, Captain Awesome. I'm glad you're here today. Glad to see you. I have got my tea. I don't have a cookie today. Trying to cut down all these days inside, trying to make sure I don't gain too much weight. I got some lovely ginger tea today. So I think you can go ahead and get yours and get settled in. And today we're going to talk about a really cool animal that most of you are probably more familiar with as food, and that's a lobster. But a lobster is a really amazing animal with a lot of really cool things about it. And we're going to talk about that kind of stuff. Before we begin, I'd love it if you guys joined me over on my Instagram. That's at Cape Cod Explorer. And of course, if you're here, you're on the Facebook page. I'm trying to keep more stuff like I'm doing from other locations posted here as well. I highly recommend a site called Macaroni Kids. We have a Macaroni Kids Cape Cod. If you're not from Cape Cod, I'm sure there's one in your area. And this has a great listing of all the stuff that's happening every day. Live streams, interactive, educational. There's one I'm actually interested in, which is an American Sign Language class. I'm thinking about taking it because I have adult children and none of them listen to me, so I'm beginning to wonder if they're actually maybe a little bit deaf. I'm not sure. Maybe sign language will work. Without further ado, let's get right in on the lobster. Now, first of all, that's not actually how it's spelled. It's Lobster, but there is the running joke about the New England accent. I have lived in many different parts of the country. I've lived in California, I've lived in South Carolina, but I'm pretty much a New Englander through and through. If I could figure out how to repair a tractor with baling wire, I absolutely will. And I can throw the accent around with the best of them. True story. I had a cousin, Gerard. He lived on a farm up in Vermont. He knew how to drive a tractor. One time he had to go down to Boston because he was sick. He had to go to the hospital, but he turned around and went home because he couldn't find a place to park the car. See, we can all do it. That Mark Wahlberg stuff is ridiculous. Don't believe that for a second. So the lobster, really a cool animal. We're going to start with some basic kind of facts. Okay? I'm not sure how long this will last. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to pop in and ask. As always, I reserve the right to say, I don't know. That's the basis of science because they don't know and they wanted to find out. And I reserve the right to say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. As a matter of fact, over the last 10 sessions that I've done, I've had a number of questions. I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can over the next couple of days. First, taxonomy of the lobster. It's in the animal kingdom. It is an animal. Its phylum is Arthropoda. Arthropod. It's in the same phylum as spiders, which are arachnids, and insects, which fall into a whole bunch of different categories. And it's a crustacean, which includes the lobsters and the shrimps. And it's decapoda. Poda meaning foot, deca meaning 10. It has 10 feet. 10 claws, and it's in the Portonida family, which is the family of swimming crabs and lobsters. Now, we tend not to think too much of lobsters as swimming, but if you don't mind, I'm going to show you a very quick video of a lobster swimming. So this is a diver who came across a lobster. It's a spiny lobster. We'll talk about that in a little bit. He's got to wear gloves because they are when they say spiny, they are spiny. In fact, one of the ways that people catch them in California is simply by putting some, look at that, look, did you see that? Let me go back a little bit while I was talking to you a little too much. He lets it go, incredible flaps of that tail, and off he goes. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but he's also very, very streamlined. His body is made to propel himself through the water when he has that opportunity. It's an incredible escape. Hold on. It's an incredible escape technique, that really powerful, burst of the tail, and the lobster swims away. All lobsters can do that, and that's why they're in the family with swimming crabs. That's also why that tail is filled with that meat, because that's a real big muscle that makes that happen. They're in the same family as shrimp and other types of lobsters. There are a couple of different kinds of lobsters, a couple of really neat ones. Again, the animal world is really good at making variation, for sure. There's 13 major groups of lobsters. I'm not going to get into all of them. We're going to talk about a couple of quick ones, and then we're going to dive into the one that we are most familiar with here in the northern part of North America. They're familiar with different lobsters in California and Florida. The first is this neat lobster called a slipper lobster. It's a real beautiful lobster. It has 10 legs. This one is missing a little bit of a leg. It looks like it's been bitten off, but it's got 3, 4, 5 on each side. Those flat kind of shovel-shaped things are the modification of claws that we see on our big lobsters. These are common in all different kinds of waters. And the next picture I'm going to show you is of something some of you are familiar with as a Yeti crab, but it's actually a type of lobster. This is a deep sea vent lobster, a type of slipper lobster. It has these huge hairy arms, and as we're going to talk about, that hairy arm is how they smell. Those hairs are filled with chemoreceptors and olfactory sensors. So that's how the lobster smells. This is a spiny lobster, a blue spiny lobster. There's a number of different species of spiny lobster. Again, it's missing that big, large front claw, has these huge antennae, and it is one of the spikiest animals, short of a sea urchin, that I've ever encountered. It's an amazingly protected and armored creature that does not stop other animals from eating it, however. And then, of course, we've got our local lobster, the Omerus americanus, or the North Atlantic lobster, both on the British side of the water and on our side of the water. This is the one we're familiar with. It has these 2 large claws, one with a small serrated edge for kind of tearing, and one with a bumpy edge for crushing. They can give 100 pounds of pressure per square inch. They can crack open clams and crabs and things like that. They are opportunistic feeders. They will eat almost anything. They will scavenge. They will eat things that are alive. They will. They're not a great animal to have in a tank because they will eat all of the other stuff. Okay, so those are the kind of main types. We're going to talk about that big one. I'm going to talk about the life cycle of the lobster. This is a really amazing thing. So lobsters are male and female. The female, in this case, is on the right side of the picture. He has these top swimmerettes, which are loose and flappy. The male, on the left, has these 2 swimmerettes that you see going between its legs that are very hard. They make 2 halves of a straw. They come together and they make a straw. So when the female is ready to accept mating, the male uses that straw to pass what's called a sperm packet over to the female. Now here's the amazing thing. Lindsay has a question. Does the Yeti crab get aggressive sometimes? I'm not sure. That's a deep sea crab. There's not a lot known about its behavior, but I think that it would be safe to assume that they are territorial because they are always looking to attract a mate, and so they want to find a good spot. So it might get aggressive towards other animals, as they all will in their own defense. I know that lobsters, the ones we're talking about, are cannibalistic. So if they get into a fight over territory or a mate, one will actually consume the other. So back to the mating of the lobster. So a female lobster obviously wants to make sure that its offspring is going to survive. And while we try to make our offspring better as far as getting them a better education and a better job and stuff, lobsters want to ensure their offspring have certain features that make them more capable of surviving. That could be coloration, that could be food. So let's say that Susie, we're going to name the female lobster Susie. Susie comes across Bob. Bob's got a great den. He's got plenty of food around. The current's really good. The water's clean. So Susie says, you know what, Bob, I think I'm okay to reproduce with you. So she will accept a sperm packet from Bob, but she cannot reproduce until it's time for her to molt. So she holds on to that sperm packet. Now she's out, doing her thing, and she comes across Steve. Steve's got a better den. He's got better food. It's a little bit bigger. His coloration's a little off, but you know what? He's got all this other good stuff going on. So she takes a sperm packet from Steve. Now, she can do one of two things. She can get rid of Bob's sperm packet and just keep Steve's, or she can keep them both. And then when she does lay eggs, she can fertilize them with the one sperm packet or the both sperm packets. She can do that with multiple sperm packets. So she can choose mates depending on their traits. She can hold on to the sperm packets, and then she can reproduce, she can fertilize her eggs with one or a number of them. Now, two different sperm can't fertilize the same egg. So what happens is, mixed in that batch of eggs are a number of different offspring from a number of different males, all which have traits which could lead to their survival or success later. So that's pretty amazing in and of itself. And then the life cycle of the lobster is pretty cool. These are the eggs. Now, sometimes when you cook a lobster, you'll break open the tail and there'll be like a bright red streak, like a gummy kind of thing down the middle. It tastes delicious. Those are eggs that the female has not released. Those are still inside of her. These are eggs on the tail of this female that are fertilized, and in fact, because they're black, we know that they're almost ready to hatch. They are sticky to each other and sticky to her swimmerettes, and so she will carry those around with her. And then when it's time for them to hatch, they will all hatch at approximately the same time. She'll swim her swimmerettes and flap them around and expel the larva out into the water column. And it's there that the larvae become basically on their own. So the early years, when we say early years, we're talking about maybe the first year, right? The newly hatched larva is tiny, 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 less than a millimeter across. They go through 1, 2, 3, 4 different stages, which all look fairly similar. They just are getting kind of bigger, right? The larva is what's substantially different. These three in the middle are called zoa, Z-O-A. And then the last one is basically just an immature lobster. It's fully formed. It looks exactly like a lobster. And it is maybe as long as my pinky nail. Sometimes not even that long. If you're down in Woods Hole, at the Woods Hole Aquarium, which is part of the National Aquarium System, they sometimes will have larval lobsters in little boxes on the glass of the aquarium. This is a picture of a larval lobster that I took from a plankton sample in the boardwalk at Sandwich. Pretty amazing. This is the very earliest stages of a lobster. There were more than one in the sample. Again, all the eggs hatch at the same time, so you'll find very many of them oftentimes in the same sample of water. And these are the 4 stages. Again, they look very similar. We don't have the larval stage. We've got the 3 zoa stage and then the small version of an adult. There is some pigment in there. Look at how large the eye is. Again, trying to avoid predators and find other things to eat as well. This is when they're in the planktonic column. So Lindsay, I use a plankton net, which has a very, very fine mesh, and then I strain it and then I put it on a slide, and I took that picture actually with a special apparatus that I have that I put my phone on. But we do plankton programs where we have a video camera that we put on a microscope, and we can watch the stuff swimming around on the TV. Keep an eye on the Facebook page. When I do that, we'll let everybody know. We won't be doing it for a little while, but we definitely try to do that a number of times a year. Lastly, this is a spiny lobster. This is the small version of the adult, the last of the larval stages. Look at the antenna. It's mostly clear because it's easy to not be eaten if you can't be seen. So they're transparent in an attempt to kind of just hide in the water. It's very tough. And then they'll drop down to the bottom very soon and start their life at the bottom of the ocean. That's the basics of the life cycle of the lobster. And then we're going to talk about molting. Okay? So lobsters have the ability to regenerate a limb. I'm going to tell two stories here real quick that all tie into each other. We already know Bob and Steve. Bob and Steve were fighting for Sue's affections. So let's say that Bob has a nice little cave with a nice little food supply, and Steve wants it. So Steve and Bob get into a fight. And in that process, Bob rips off Steve's arm, and Steve scuttles off into the sea. Bob moves into his cave, gets his food. Sue likes him a little bit better. Steve, meanwhile, is off and about, growing a new limb. Another thing about lobsters is they have a fantastic sense of smell with what they call a long scent memory. So when Steve and Bob were fighting, and Bob ripped off his arm, and Steve started to grow a new one, right? 20 years later, they might meet up with each other, and now they're more evenly matched. They're maybe going to have a fight. Not going to happen, because Steve remembers Bob's scent and is not going to risk losing that limb again. 20, 30, 40 years, we don't know how long they have this scent memory may last, but it lasts a really long time. In the meantime, they can grow back their limbs. This guy lost a claw, an antenna, and a small leg. And as he molts and as he grows, a little bit grows back every time. It takes about 4 or 5 molts for the leg or the claw and the antenna to be fully grown back to its thing. The thing about a lobster is, remember, it's an arthropod. That means that it has an exoskeleton. So when the lobster gets too big to be inside of its own shell, it has to climb out of its shell. And it does that by that joint where the front and the thorax and the tail meet. He bends and he climbs out backwards. I'm going to go back to another video that I have of a time lapse of a lobster. You see that bend where it's bent over? You just keep an eye on it as the new lobster climbs out. This video lasts about 45 seconds. You can see it's opening. The top of the shell is lifting up, and the lobster is still underneath it. The tail is splitting. Oh, okay, one more. This is a calico lobster doing the same thing. Coming out of the old shell and split. It's kind of confusing, but this is the tail at the bottom coming out of the old shell. Something that's rather dangerous for the lobster because it's very helpless and its shell is very soft. This is a time when a lot of other animals and predators would eat the lobster because it doesn't have the ability to squish its claws because they're not hard, its skeleton is formed, and it's very soft. In the wild, that lobster tends to eat its shell. And that is what helps it get that material of chitin. That is what its shell is made out of. We talked about the horseshoe crab the other day. We talked about how the horseshoe crab's exoskeleton is made out of the same stuff as our fingernails and hair, and that's keratin. And the lobster shell is made of chitin, which is a different thing. So, very, very interesting. What's funny is that soft-shell lobsters are in some places considered a delicacy. Some people will eat soft-shell lobsters like we eat soft-shell crabs, but they're harder to come across because when they molt, they tend to hide under a rock or another thing like that. So that's the molting part. And then we're going to talk about the different colors that lobsters come in. This is the rarest of the colored lobsters. This is called a ghost lobster. Very, very pale. It is not, however, a true albino. If it was a true albino, its eye would be pink or red because it would have no pigments whatsoever. These lobsters occur about between 1 and 75 to 100.
These cicadas in the eastern United
lobsters.
States spend
Then we have
17
the
whole
calico
years below
lobster.
ground.
This
sucking
occurs
sap
about
from
1
tree
in
roots.
50
and
million
then,
lobsters.
within a few days,
We've
a
got a
whole
blue lobster
population
that happens
emerges.
about 1 in 10 million lobsters. And then I can't even tell you what this number is. Lobsters are bilaterally symmetrical. That means they're basically the same on both sides. And every once in a while, some genetic thing happens where they're a different color on one side than the other. It's pretty amazing. We don't know why
they clamber up the trees whose roots have provided them with sap
Some people
for
think
all
that
of
it's
those
just a genetic
17
mutation.
years.
Some people think it's because of their diet. Some people think it's because of their water. Oh, okay, hold on. Better? Yes. Again, I'm kind of an old man and new to this whole technical stuff, so I'm sorry about that issue. I think I got it, Jamie. Tell me, can you hear it? I don't hear anything now. I think I'm good. All right, excellent. Thank you. So yeah, we have this different colorations happen, and we're not sure exactly why they happen. If you ever get to go up to Boothbay Harbor, Maine. Maine, of course, is kind of the epicenter of lobstering in the United States. They have a really fabulous place called the Lobster Research Center. And it can tell you everything that we basically know about lobsters. It's really, really an amazing spot. I've caught a lot of lobsters. I've handled a lot of lobsters. I'll tell you a funny story. So I used to work for a group called Ocean Quest, and we would go out and pick up lobster traps and talk about the animals that we found in them. One time we had this gentleman and his wife and son who had come from New York City, Manhattan. And this gentleman was incredibly proud that he had never set foot outside of Manhattan. Gone to school in Manhattan, college in Manhattan, had a job in Manhattan, didn't need anything outside of Manhattan. Anything you could possibly want to find out, you could find out in Manhattan. And his wife had finally put her foot down and said, we're going somewhere. My son is not going to spend his entire life on this island. So they came to Cape Cod. And they took a trip on Ocean Quest. And we pulled a lobster out of the trap. And I gave basically this whole talk that I just gave right now. And I said to the people, I said, does anybody have any questions? And the guy says, yeah, I got a question. I said, yes, sir. He goes, where are those little things in its claws? The little pegs in its claws to keep them from being able to open and squish people when they are getting them out of the tanks. And I had to explain to him that they did not come with those pegs or those rubber bands. That lobsters in the wild open their claws all they want to be able to eat, but he had never in his life seen a lobster without those pegs or the rubber bands. So he thought that was how they came. I always find that very interesting. Couple of fun facts. 1, lobsters turn bright red when cooked. Doesn't matter what color they are when they're in the water. Blue, white. Only albinos stay white because they have no pigment. But lobsters turn bright red when they cook. That's because of these two chemicals that you see underneath there, astaxanthin and crustacyanin. So picture the astaxanthin is a bright red molecule. It's the bright red color. But it's covered outside by crustacyanin. And this mutes the red and brings out the blues and the greens. So when the light strikes it, it gets reflected by the part that's on the outside, right? So when you cook it, the crustacyanin falls off. And that astaxanthin is what really pops, so it makes it red, right? It's the same for most of the crustaceans that you cook that turn red. Lobsters, crabs, shrimp, all that sort of stuff. People often say it's because of iodine. That is not the case. We don't know how long they live. We know that when Europeans first came here, they caught massive sized lobsters. And we slowly wiped out the fishery. They've made a comeback over time with rules and regulations. I couldn't find an actual what the biggest lobster in historical times was, but it was not uncommon around the turn of the century for people to catch 30 to 35 pound lobsters. That almost never happens now. If we think a lobster's that big, it's because a claw broke off in the cage. And some scientists believe that as long as there is food and as long as they can molt, the lobster will just continue to live. We don't know how long. We know that we found animals that live in cold water where lobsters live. For instance, the Greenland shark, which is over 300 years old. So it's possible that lobsters could live an incredibly long time. They taste and they smell with their legs. When you pick up a lobster, you'll see that it has these fine hairs all over its body and its antenna. These are the chemoreceptors, or the olfactory sensors that smell. So when a lobster is in the water, let's say that we had something died. Let's say a fish died and had sunk to the bottom. And those molecules are being carried on the current, and they wash over the lobster. And then the lobster turns in the direction of the current and smelling it. Lindsay, I get you. Ew, right? Smelly, gross fish. That is pepperoni pizza to a lobster, right? So they turn until that current is washing all those molecules over them, and then they walk in a line until they get to that big dead animal that they get to now eat. Remember, this may help Bob or Steve get bigger and stronger, so Susie's more attracted to them, right? They chew with their stomachs. They tear off these kind of big pieces of meat and stuff them down. And then they have this first stomach that has these two plates that are called gastric for the gastric system, the stomach, mill, because it literally grinds and mills them together. And it doesn't look much different than my knuckles actually look. And it just grinds the food up and moves it down into its stomach and liver. This is one of my favorites. We love lobster. Lobster's very expensive. Right now here on the Cape, lobster costs about $5 a pound because of the issue that we're having right now. But it was once illegal to feed lobsters to prisoners. They were so common, there were so many of them, that the prison system was actually sued, and they couldn't feed them to prisoners more than 2 days in a row. After a storm, people would go scoop them up off of the beach and fertilize their gardens with them. They were so common. Once it became known that they were a wonderful thing to eat, of course, they became expensive. That's kind of the way things goes. So that's 30 minutes on the lobster. I'm glad that you joined me today. I hope that everybody is doing okay with this quarantine. Lots of fun stuff to find and do on the internet. Lots of fun stuff to watch on television. Now's the time to catch up on that book that you've been meaning to read or the book that you've been meaning to write. This could be the time that you start painting or doing any number of those things that you're interested in doing. I hope you enjoyed having tea time with me. I certainly enjoyed having tea time with you. Remember, be nice, be kind, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.